Hi, I'm Tina.
And I'm Rich.
If there's one thing we've learned in over 20 years of marriage,
It's that some days you'll feel like killing your wife.
and some days you'll feel like killing your husband.
Welcome to Love, Marry, Kill.
Hi, Rich.
Hi, Tina.
How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. We recorded yesterday, so I really don't have anything to say to you.
I
So it's
don't
Tuesday, Taco Tuesday. I didn't make tacos.
No,
Did you make tacos?
no, I didn't make
I
tacos
did
either.
make something for you, though.
I am excited about whatever
You
it
are?
is you made because you worked hard on it and you gave me a little taste
I
of
did.
one component of it, which I don't even know what it was, but it tasted really good.
Well, I'll tell you now, it was pastry cream. I've never made
Oh,
cream before, or what do they call it on the Great British Bake Off?
I have no idea.
Creme patisserie?
Oh, okay.
I just butchered that word, didn't I? How would you say it?
I think you said it right.
Okay, well, I have good news for you. This is really exciting news, and I
Okay.
feel like as a society, this is going to help all of us.
Really?
The Great British Bake Off is returning in
Oh,
September.
that is so good. I
Yeah,
think we
it's the
we
best
do
show.
we do need that as a
I
society.
think collectively, most people can agree that that's a really just heartwarming, sweet show.
It's all so positive. It's a
Mhm.
competition, but everyone is nice to each other and everyone helps each other and yeah, it's just a really nice show.
Yeah, it does make you, it's just instant dopamine. I mean, it just came to me. I think they call it like creme pat,
Oh, that makes
like for
sense.
short.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'm excited to share our snack with you. But before we get to that, I also wanted to mention that there is a new movie coming in December that you were going to be really excited to see.
Okay.
Downton Abbey, the final chapter.
I just saw a commercial for it. I was out in the kitchen and there was a commercial and I was like, oh boy.
I didn't realize that they were making like a final one, and that
Mm.
show also just warms my weird little heart. I really love it. I don't really like period pieces, but
Hmm.
it's just a really heartwarming show also, and just really funny. Maggie Smith has passed on,
Mm.
and she was really just the funniest character on that show, so I don't know if
Yeah.
she'll be replaced
Mm.
or if maybe she filmed it before her death, but
Well, I have really good news for you
okay.
because there's another movie coming out that you're going to be really excited about.
Oh boy.
And that is the sequel to Spinal Tap is coming out.
Oh, I
So
mean that's exciting. It's a fun
I
movie.
think it'll,
I
yeah,
think you really loved Spinal Tap,
I
where I
really loved it.
thought it was, pretty. It's funny.
Yeah. Such a ringing endorsement. It's funny.
I have one more show that I'm again embarrassed to tell you guys that I'm watching, but the podcast sometimes is like a confessional. Like
Uh-huh.
you have to tell everyone what you're up to. I've been watching a show called, you've probably never even heard of it. It's called The Summer I Turned Pretty. It's on Amazon, and it's really for people like 40 years younger than no, not 40, but it's for much younger people.
Uh-huh.
But
Is this a reality show or this is like
no,
a
it's
drama
but I
comedy?
feel like the people who watch Love Island are probably also tuning into The Summer I Turned Pretty.
Okay.
But
A guilty pleasure type of show?
yeah, a lot of people messaged us after I talked about Love Island. If
Mhm.
you are watching The Summer I Turned Pretty, I kind of need to talk to someone about it because, well, the nugget is there's this young woman named Belly, and
Belly.
she has, well, Isabella, and she has been friends with these two men, these two boys, brothers, for her whole life.
Mhm.
And, essentially it's like a love triangle, like
Okay.
which brother is she going to choose? And I have opinions, but I don't want to do any spoilers. So
Okay.
anyway, yeah. Do you want to see your snack that I've been?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Here, hold on. I made a Boston cream pie today.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever had Boston cream pie?
No, not like a real. I think I've had, I don't know. I've had something called Boston cream pie, but it doesn't look like that.
So I wasn't sure if I would have time to make this today, so I did buy, it's in like a little box, like a Hostess fruit pie, like you
Oh,
can.
okay, yeah.
But I was going to try to make one if I had time, and I decided to just do it today. So it's not a pie; it's a cake.
Cake, yeah.
And then there's the creme patisserie in the middle, and then there's like chocolate ganache on the
Oh,
top.
it looks really good.
Do you want to give it a try?
Yes.
What did you think of the Boston cream pie?
It was really, really good. Yeah.
What would you rate it?
10 out of 10. I mean, it
I
was,
can't tell you why I made Boston cream pie, but we're going to get to
oh,
that
really?
a
It's going to
little
be
in a little
related to our
bit.
case?
It is definitely related to our case today. I also thought it was really good, and I don't want to brag, but I'm, pretty proud of this one.
You should be.
I never know how much I should talk about recipes when I make them, but
Mhm.
I'm going to give anyone out there who is a baker a tip. We didn't have any cream, and I didn't really feel like going to the store. So we had skim milk. So I just put some butter into the skim milk, and that kind of makes it into
Oh,
cream. I was nervous to do that because I've never made pastry cream before,
yeah.
but I think it turned out really good.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, let's get back to Betty. If you haven't listened to part one, go back and do that. You are going to give us a brief synopsis, but before we have you do that, I'm going to give a content warning. This episode contains harsh language. Today is extra harsh language and discussion of suicide, so please listen with care.
Betty and Dan Broderick were married in 1965. From the beginning, they both harbored doubts about their marriage, but coming from strong Catholic families, they were committed, for better or worse. They had struggled through some lean years as Dan finished first medical school and then law school, while their family expanded to 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, Kim, Lee, Dan Jr., and Rhett. Betty had always dreamed of having a big family and threw herself into motherhood and lamented that Dan was often busy working and had little time to spend with the family. After relocating to the La Jolla area of San Diego, Dan started his own law practice. The Brodericks were thriving financially and enjoying the spoils of their riches. When we left off, Betty was nearly certain that Dan had tired of their marriage and began an affair with his young assistant, Linda Kolkina. In part 1, we talked about the beginning of the Brodericks' marriage. In episode 2, we'll talk about the unraveling of their marriage.
In part one, I didn't do a very good job talking about La Jolla. La Jolla is an enclave of San Diego. It's where the wealthy people live. It's
Right.
the part that's, has the ocean views.
Mhm.
Very exclusive.
Yes.
At 21, Linda Bernadette Kolkina began working as a receptionist in the same building as Dan Broderick's law office. Linda was born in June 1961, the youngest of 4 children of Dutch immigrants, Everdina and A.J. Kolkina. She was raised in the Salt Lake City area in a close-knit but financially modest family. To help pay tuition for the Catholic school the children attended, A.J. took on part-time janitorial work there. When the expense became too much, the Kolkina children moved to public school. When Linda was 11, tragedy struck. Her mother died of breast cancer at just 36 years old. Only 6 months later, her father married a Dutch widow. After graduating high school, Linda held a string of odd jobs before becoming a Delta Airlines flight attendant at age 20. The job lasted just 8 months. She was dismissed for conduct unbecoming of a Delta employee while on an off-duty flight headed to a ski holiday, during which witnesses claimed she sat on a man's lap, kissed him, and later disappeared with him into the lavatory.
I'm pretty sure that's a no-no if you're a
Yeah.
flight attendant.
The flight attendant on duty asked Linda her name, and she supplied a false name, used coarse language, and then continued to carry on with the male passenger. When Dan hired Linda as his legal assistant, she was 21 and he was 38. Linda had only brief experience in a law office and little relevant training. Betty was shocked to learn her husband's new hire didn't even know how to type. When she confronted Dan, he dismissed her concerns, saying typing wasn't part of the job description. Friends of the couple couldn't help noticing that Linda bore a striking resemblance to a younger version of Betty. Their voices even sounded the same. So I've looked at 100 pictures of Betty and Linda and Dan, and they definitely have a very striking resemblance to each other. Yeah, not in the at Betty's older years, but yeah, in her younger years, definitely. And they were both like tall, striking blonde women.
Yeah, so Dan definitely had a type.
Yeah. Betty issued an ultimatum. Dan had 1 month until October 1st to replace the bimbo, as she called Linda, or she would leave him. The date came and went, and Linda was still in Dan's employ. He made it clear that he would hire whomever he wanted. Betty's opinion be damned, and if anyone was going to leave his house, it would be her. Betty had issued ultimatums before, but Dan ignored them all. She held little leverage in the marriage. Dan continued to gaslight Betty. He insisted there was nothing going on between him and Linda. I think sometimes people get confused about the definition of gaslighting, but this is one of the clearest examples of gaslighting I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's obviously having an affair and he's telling his wife, no, there's no affair going on
Right.
here.
Nothing to see here.
When Betty found out later that Dan had bought Linda a car, a condo, and paid her orthodontic bill, she said, I should have divorced him then, before all the rest happened, before I let him convince everybody I was crazy, that he was justified in what he was doing, because at that point, I still had my reputation, and my sanity, and my children. Linda's friends and family came to her defense. She was no bimbo. She had only been with a handful of men in her life, and she deeply loved Dan. She knew the affair was wrong. The guilt gnawed at her. When he began, she was still dating her boyfriend, Steve Kelly. Suspicious, Kelly confronted Dan directly, asking him if he was involved with Linda. Dan denied it. Kelly later said he never liked Dan. He found him cold, aloof, and dismissive. Linda urged Dan to end his marriage long before he finally did, at one point even giving him an ultimatum. Dan's got
A lot of ultimatums coming at him.
Definitely. Dan had been unhappy with Betty for years, and by all accounts, he probably would have divorced her eventually, with or without Linda in the picture. Still, their relationship wasn't without friction. Linda often grew frustrated with Dan, especially when she felt that he was too lenient with Betty. And theirs wasn't a torrid love affair. Linda complained to friends that Dan rarely wanted to have sex with her. Linda's friends begged her to leave Dan. One friend said, quote, Linda was so stressed out. She lost weight. She used to carry Maalox in her purse at 26, 27 years old. Her nails were bitten to the quick. She said Betty was driving them crazy, and she couldn't do anything to please those kids. The emotional battery in this case was never against Betty. It was against them. On November 7th, 1983, Betty's 37th birthday, she made a gourmet dinner and purchased a Baskin-Robbins cake, the kids' favorite. When Dan didn't come home or call, Betty was bereft. Later that night, in a moment of despair, she tried to take her own life by swallowing pills and slitting her wrists. I never want to dismiss anyone's attempt of suicide, but in this case, Kim, Betty's daughter, said in her book that it was a faint-hearted attempt. When Betty awoke the next morning, Dan bandaged her wrist and told her that she was crazy. There was nothing going on at the office. Betty went about her day as she always did, pretending everything was okay. She decided to see a psychologist, but quit after only a few sessions. Her girlfriends gave her better advice than the therapist. She was adamant that Dan needed help, not her. Weeks later, on Dan's birthday, Betty got dressed up and stopped by his office, which she rarely did. She had roses and a bottle of Dom Perignon in her hand. Finding balloons, the remnants of a birthday cake, and both Dan and Linda gone for the day, Betty was overcome with sadness and rage. She poked her head into Linda's office and saw a picture of her and Dan together. She was also shocked at the posh furnishings of Linda's office. It was lavishly decorated, and considering her role as Dan's assistant, it was a little over the top. Well, and she had a picture of, it was Linda and Dan, just to make it clear.
Yeah.
That's pretty bold.
Yeah, for sure.
And I said that Betty poked her head into the office. In all likelihood, Betty probably rummaged through everything in the office, looking for proof and details. Later, Betty said, it was the worst pain I've ever felt. I didn't want to believe it, but I believed it. Once home, she tore every piece of Dan's prized wardrobe from the closet, hurled it into the backyard, soaked it with gasoline, and set it ablaze.
Wow.
If you remember from part 1, Dan's image and his clothing was all very fancy.
Right.
He loved to dress, and even before they had money, he bought designer labels and had custom suits and dressed the very best. So this was, a really good way of showing him how she felt.
Yeah, yes.
When the fire had burned down to embers, Betty poured paint over the charred remains. Her only regret was that the children had witnessed it. They cried and begged her to stop. To add to Betty's humiliation, a fire truck pulled up to the house after a neighbor had called, seeing the rising dark smoke. In the years that followed, this particular act would be remembered as one of Betty's tamer displays of vengeance.
Oh, boy.
Dan was still denying the affair to Betty and would for 2 more agonizing years. But he and Linda were openly a couple among Dan's circle of friends and colleagues.
Why do you think he denied it for so long when it seems like it was so obvious and, it seems like he was pretty committed to his new relationship?
That's a really good question, and I don't have an answer for you other than I think that he didn't want to get divorced then, or maybe remember like they were accumulating a lot of wealth
Mm-hmm.
and he might have been like setting things up for a divorce.
Okay, so maybe just trying to take his time, lay the
Maybe.
groundwork, and
Yeah, but maybe early on he didn't think he wanted a divorce,
yeah.
but later on he did.
It would be really tough being married to a lawyer and having a bad marriage or having it go south because
I mean,
you're just in
absolutely.
such a bad position. Like you just know the lawyer is going to be able to, do whatever they want and take you for a ride if they want.
Well, and that is one of the key factors in this case. And if your husband is Dan Broderick, who was known as just an excellent lawyer, it made it even harder.
Yeah. Dan Broderick was indeed a legal mastermind. No one can dispute that. He had been planning the exit from his marriage for years, and unfortunately, his plan was to leave Betty with as few resources as possible. California, even in 1985, was a community property state, but there would be no equal division of assets in the Broderick marriage. Dan would make sure of that. When their family home had a cracked foundation, they were forced to move out for several months during the repair. They rented a house on the beach, but later Dan moved back into their house on Coral Reef Avenue as if to stake his claim. He sold Betty's Jaguar and leased her another car. This left Betty with no equity. Despite his affair with Linda, Betty remained hopeful that Dan would come to his senses and feel compelled to keep their family intact. Betty was sure that Dan would tire of his mistress. She was pretty, but boring, and nowhere near as smart as Betty. Dan needed a partner who could challenge him, go toe-to-toe with him. Linda didn't have a college degree and couldn't even type.
I read a lot of different articles with quotes from Betty, and a lot of times she said she couldn't even type. So I wanted to say that a few times in my script.
Gotcha. Betty did everything she could to keep her family together and her husband interested. Facials, expensive hair salon treatments, and even visiting the plastic surgeon for several procedures. She read books on midlife crises, found even more creative ways to spend time with her kids. Every waking moment of Betty's day was filled with thoughts of self-improvement and saving her marriage. But Dan continued to gaslight her, insinuate she was crazy, and insist he wasn't having an affair as he continued to withdraw from Betty and their family. In a last-ditch effort, Betty went to see a doctor about reversing her tubal ligation to have another child. Dan seemed excited at the idea of expanding their family. Betty wishfully thought that maybe Dan wasn't really having an affair. Dan later said that he continued to lie to Betty because she was mentally unstable and he was afraid of her. Here's Betty talking to Oprah.
Did you ask him if he was having an affair?
Yes.
And he said...
Totally denied it and said I was imagining things and I was crazy and that Linda was a sweet, innocent young girl and there was absolutely nothing going on. Never was. And oh, and by the way, you're fat, old, boring, ugly, and stupid just started coming on the scene then. He was unhappy with everything in his life.
He told you that you were fat and old and boring and stupid? He said
yes,
those words
and he
to you?
didn't like our home, and he didn't like our children, and it was, to me, it was an absolute classic midlife crisis. And I devoured every book on the subject.
To the point of even he got the red Corvette, is that true?
Got the red Corvette, the risky business sunglasses, the scarf around his neck, the leather jacket. I told him he was the American joke.
Thanks to our special correspondent, Oprah Winfrey, for that interview.
I forgot that Oprah was on our payroll. Thank you, Oprah.
We've gotten better about using clips, and I hope that this doesn't get tagged because it's like a 30-year-old interview, so it'll probably be okay.
Yeah.
I know we haven't talked about exactly what's going to happen yet, but I think everyone can see the writing on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Even in this brief clip, you can tell that Betty is not willing to take any accountability for what happened in their marriage.
Yeah, she definitely seems like...
And she's angry, very angry.
Yes. How long after whatever happened did this interview take place? Was it...
I'm not really sure. Within
years?
a year.
Oh,
no,
within a year.
just 1 year.
Okay.
But if you asked Betty the same questions today, she would respond in the exact same way, I believe.
Yeah. Kim Broderick, in her book, Betty Broderick, the mother, the murderer, wrote that during this time her mother was, quote, difficult and coarse, and even though in years past she could be loads of fun, that mom was gone and had been gone for some time. Overcome with her own life and circumstances, she lashed out at every opportunity, and we, being the only ones around, ended up being the unintended recipients of her fury. In November 1984, Betty planned an elaborate 5-day 40th birthday party for Dan. She flew in family members and booked them all hotels. Upon arrival in San Diego, everyone was handed a printed and demanding schedule, each moment of the next 5 days meticulously planned. They went to SeaWorld, Tijuana, and a USC Notre Dame game. The weekend culminated in a lively party with all of Dan's friends and family, where laughter and celebration filled the night. Betty had a true flair for the birthdays and holidays. She knew exactly how to make every gathering sparkle. We'll be back after a break.
A few months later, on February 28th, Dan came home and abruptly told Betty he was leaving her. Not necessarily permanently, but he needed time apart to think things through. He moved back to their Coral Reef home that was under construction, which may have been a defensive move on his part from preventing Betty from getting the house. But on St. Patrick's Day, after a day of drinking, Dan showed up at Betty's. He must have been feeling sentimental. As an Irish Catholic, it was his favorite holiday. He and Betty had sex, and for a brief moment, she again thought that she might win him back for good. But that hope evaporated quickly. When the rental home became infested with rats, Betty called Dan for help, only to be told to deal with it herself. Now she was seething with red-hot anger. How dare Dan walk away, leaving her with 4 children and an army of rats chewing through her designer gowns without ever once checking in on them. So this scene described in Betty's book was pretty harrowing. Like there were rats like running around and the kids were scared, and
That sounds awful.
it does sound awful. Betty's close friend, Candy Westbrook, later said, "You literally couldn't ask Betty about the weather without her finding a way to bring the conversation back to Dan and Linda. It was all she would talk about. She just didn't want it to be." But Betty was planning a trip to New York for her father's 75th birthday. Before leaving, she dropped the children off at Dan's house without telling him. When he came home to find them sitting alone in the dark, he was shocked and furious. But Kim, the oldest Broderick sibling, remembers the incident differently. "It was Easter. I asked her to drive my friend home, and she lost it. She said, 'Pack your bags.'" When Betty dropped Kim off at Dan's, no one was home, and she waited hours on the doorstep for Dan to return. A few days later, Danny arrived the same way, followed by Rhett and Lee a month and a half later. So one by one, she sent the kids to Dan's house, and she couldn't deal with them.
Yeah.
Kim recalled, "The boys were hysterical, holding on to her, crying and screaming, crying hard. 'Don't leave us here.' It was awful. She said, 'I'm leaving. Your dad's not going to get away with this.'" Other than the murders she'd later commit, this decision would haunt Betty for the next 3 years and beyond. Later in a session with a therapist, Betty fumed. "You know what that fucker did? He just kept them." Betty convinced herself that once Dan had the children full-time, he would finally realize how much he needed her, that after experiencing firsthand the work she put in, he would beg her to return. But Dan was not the kind of man to admit such things. With the money to hire an army of people to care for the children, he didn't need Betty. The real tragedy was that caught in the middle of all this bitterness, the children were left feeling as though neither parent truly wanted them. Betty was able to see and talk to Kim, Lee, Danny, and Red, but she never regained full custody of them.
It is really sad. It does. I can see how they would feel that way. Like, yeah, mom drops us off because she doesn't want us, and then dad just hires, a bunch of help, and he doesn't really want to spend time with us either.
Yeah, it was very hard on the children. Betty accused Linda of sending her a photo of she and Dan together before he filed for divorce. The typed post-it attached to the photo said, "It must kill you to see these two happy people together. Eat your heart out, bitch."
Wow.
All in caps.
Seems a little unnecessary.
Soon after, ads for weight loss products and wrinkle cream followed.
Oh.
Linda's friends adamantly denied that she would torment Betty in this way. It simply wasn't her style. I don't think Linda sent these things to Betty either.
You think Betty made this up?
I think that she did it to herself. She
Mhm.
had proof, but remember, Linda can't type, and it was typed on a Post-it note and adhered to the picture.
I mean, even someone who can't type could type, a few words on a Post-it note, but
Oh, sure, always defending Linda.
no, no.
After losing full custody of the children, Betty began a slow descent into erratic and self-destructive behavior. In the months of Betty's absence from Coral Reef Avenue, Dan had redecorated their family home, repainting and adding new furniture and flooring. When Betty walked in and saw the changes, she was furious. She called her response the beginning of her fits. She went to the store, purchased black spray paint, and did her own redecorating. Friends voiced concerns for her mental health, but Betty insisted she wasn't crazy. She was angry, and she had every right to be. So she took this black spray paint and she graffitied all over the walls.
Like the inside of the house?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah. When the lease of the rat-infested rental house was up, Betty put $140,000 down on a large $650,000 home in La Jolla with ocean views. Dan gave her the money. They'd been looking for a house with no success for years. The house needed major renovations, but Betty was hoping that she and Dan could do it together and have a fresh start. When Dan gave her the money, she took this as a green light. During this time, he limited Betty's access to their children as much as possible. But one afternoon, while visiting them at his house, Betty spotted a cake on the counter, or a Boston cream pie, Dan's favorite. She had baked that cake for him more times than she could count. What a shitty little pie, she thought out loud. When it hit her that Linda had made it, something in her snapped. She stormed upstairs and began hurling pieces of the cake through Dan's bedroom, bathroom, and closet, smearing custard and chocolate over his beloved clothes he had neatly arranged in rainbow order. In response, Dan filed a restraining order against Betty. In her book, Betty admitted only that she smeared some cake on the bedspread. How much damage can you do with one crappy little cake, even if you are really, really angry, and I was? Betty had a way of diminishing any of her trespasses as minor transgressions.
I have to say I'm a little bit relieved because where I thought you were going with that was that she was going to put something in the cake.
Oh.
And then I was going to be worried that you had put something in the cake that you had made for me, but that's
The
not
only
the
thing
case.
I put in that cake, Rich, was
Love.
love. 2 days later, she returned to the house despite the restraining order and opened the refrigerator. She found a bottle of champagne, grabbed it by the neck, and heaved it through one of the windows, shattering the window instantly.
Wow.
Dan knew that the best weapon in his arsenal, the one that he knew best, was the legal system. This infuriated Betty. Every small request resulted in a letter sent to her in legalese, and he insisted she put every request to him in writing as well. Whenever Betty stepped out of line, even in small ways, Dan marched into court and filed what's called an order to show cause, or an OSC. Each OSC required Betty to stand before a judge and explain herself, to attempt to defend her behavior again and again. Over time, her file grew thicker, a public record of her unhinged behavior and the death of a marriage. Dan also devised a system of fining Betty, but we'll get to that in a minute. Later, during their divorce trial, Dan recited these incidents in a cold, meticulous inventory. You pounded a nail in the wall with a hammer. You smashed the answering machine. You shattered the sliding glass doors. You spray painted the wallpaper, even over the fireplace. You broke the television. You cracked the plexiglass cover of the stereo. You hurled a toaster through the front window of the house.
Wow.
Some were petty, almost trivial, but others were serious and costly. But this inventory painted a picture of a woman unraveling and of a man determined to document and exact revenge for every misstep. The OSCs curtailed Betty's destructive era to an extent, but she still had a lot to say and a lot of hurt to work out. The media was captivated by the Brodericks, and their bitter, high-profile divorce came to be likened to the War of the Roses. Historically, the War of the Roses was a series of English civil wars fought between 1455 and 1487 for control of the throne. The conflict was between two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet. The House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. It ended when Lancasterian Henry Tudor defeated Yorkist King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and he became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. The Battle of Towton in 1461 is one of the bloodiest ever fought on English soil, with an estimated 28,000 casualties.
Here I thought that The War of the Roses was just a movie with Michael
Danny
Douglas
DeVito. Oh, Danny DeVito was in that movie.
no, Michael Douglas and Kathleen
Turner. Speaking of roses, Dan sent Betty a bouquet for her 38th birthday. Whether it was meant as a gesture of goodwill or a snarky reminder of their own private War of the Roses is anybody's guess. The card read, "Dear Bets, I know the circumstances will make it impossible for you to have a happy birthday this year, but I wanted you to know that the kids and I are thinking and hoping that you start to feel better soon. Dan."
Wow, that's like it feels like twisting the knife.
Do you think
a
so?
little bit. Yeah, it feels that way for
I like
sure.
to think that it's a sincere gesture, but you think it was snarky?
Maybe it was sincere, but it certainly could have been taken by Betty as being kind of snarky.
I guess "I hope you're feeling better soon." That was kind of snarky.
The OSCs piled up each month for years. Many of them were for phone messages she'd leave for Dan or the children, but we'll get to that soon. It would be impossible for us to list all of the offenses, but there were a lot.
A lot.
In May 1987, an exhausted judge sentenced Betty to 25 days in jail for 5 charges of contempt of court. She spent 6 days in jail before she apologized to the court. If she had directly apologized to the judge, she'd likely have been spared jail time. Here's the best apology she could muster. "Judge Joseph, as per your request, I promise to change my ways. I will never again call my children as long as they are living with their amoral, alcoholic, abusive father. This whole thing has been excruciatingly painful for the children and for me. They come to me, as they should, with all their heartbreak and troubles. I thought it was my duty, and I know it is my right as their mother, to be there for them always. But I will let the self-important Harvard lawyer, president of the bar, beat us all. He obviously loves beating women and children. I will do anything to escape this escalating madness." The letter went on.
So this was supposed to be an apology to the judge for contempt of court charges.
Yeah, not the best attempt at an apology I've ever heard.
Well, and also Betty accuses Dan of beating women and children, and that is not true.
Yeah. It wasn't much of an apology, but the judge set her free. Upon her release, she wrote a lengthy letter rescinding her apology and calling the judge biased. There were several more OSCs waiting for her when she returned home. When friends sympathized with her experience in jail, Betty said, "It wasn't so bad. I made some new friends."
A lot of times in this case, like you said it earlier, how could Betty have been treated fairly when Dan was president of the San Diego Bar Association and he knew all the judges and
Right.
he was really good at what he did. But then you look at this case and it does sound like the judge was somewhat tolerant of her bad behavior sometimes.
Yeah, she definitely didn't do herself any favors.
No.
By the fall of 1987, the judge, so exhausted by the Brodericks, refused to hear any more OSCs. One of the most surprising parts of Betty's story is that she started dating in the summer of 1985. His name was Brad Wright, a handsome, rugged fellow 6 years Betty's junior who owned a fencing company.
He was pretty hunky.
Was he?
Yeah.
They had an adventurous relationship, traveling and sailing together. Betty was coy about their relationship. She seemed embarrassed by his blue-collar job, although he was successful and had a degree from USC. He was a very nice man, but Betty was used to the constant sparring with Dan, and she missed that. She denied any intimacy with him, citing her conservative values and the fact that it would have been unseemly because she was still technically married. She even told some people that Brad was her gay companion. Quote, "I felt so stupid and failed and old. Here I was, getting fat in my ugly matron's dress with this young hunk, this sweet guy, but he was a nobody, and I didn't want to be the other half of a midlife crisis joke. I felt like a fool, and everybody acted as if we didn't even exist. I went overnight from front row tables to the back of the room."
I think this is kind of an important quote here because you can tell that part of the reason that she didn't want to be divorced is she liked the status of being with Dan Broderick.
Yeah.
He was, very smart, very successful, and they had a lot of status
Yeah.
together.
Well, and the fact that she refers to this guy as a nobody, I mean, that goes to that same thing, that she really didn't want to be with somebody she considered like lower
Yeah, he
status.
seemed like he was a very sweet guy who, really did support her a lot.
She saw other men too, occasionally, but Brad was smitten with Betty and was there for her, even for the hard parts that were yet to come. Dan filed for divorce soon after, in September 1985. He sat Betty down and told her what he should have told her 3 years earlier. He admitted that he had been having an affair with Linda since 1983. He was in love with her and wanted to marry her. He had no plans to reunite their family. It was all so cruel to Betty. She said, quote, "That was my job, and I was fired without cause. I hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't fair." Betty sobbed nonstop for days before she tried to piece herself back together. Her first step was to hire an attorney. Betty remembered back to the promise Dan had made in 1976 when they attended a marriage retreat. He wrote her a touching letter that she had hung her hopes on for years. Quote, "I have always thought about next summer, next year, after I make partner, after I am earning enough money to be able to afford trips, boats, etc. Even now, I believe that our lives together will be much happier when money ceases being a problem. It will enable us to do a lot of things like travel to Europe that will be shared experiences we will, I hope, enjoy and never forget. I want to be able to take you and the kids to South Bend every fall for a game without thinking twice about it. To buy a piano if Kim wants one, to buy you a ring, a motorbike, a microwave, a camera, whatever you want when you want it. I honestly believe that having this ability will make me happy and secure and will make me a more loving and more lovable person."
Things don't make you happy, Dan.
No, it really seems like they are like, or he is at least in this note, putting a lot of stock in material possessions being the key to happiness.
Yeah.
He was now breaking the promise he had made to her and the children, and it shattered her. Unable to express her pain directly, Betty's hurt instead erupted as rage and acts of violence. Dan had shipped all 4 children off to summer camps, and Betty had freedom, and she did her best to enjoy that in between missing the kids. She still had access to Dan's credit cards and used them with reckless abandon, spending as much as possible. It was the only thing that made her feel better. Her house was filled with shopping bags from high-end retailers that were never opened. They sat in corners for years. At the end of the summer, Dan told her enough and put her on a budget of $9,036 a month, $27,000 today, or $324,000 for a year.
I would take that budget if
Yeah,
you
I would
put me
too.
on it.
Same. Although she seldom received the full amount, Dan had devised a system of fining Betty without court approval, deducting money to punish her for what he deemed bad behavior. $100 for every curse word, $250 each time she stepped onto his property uninvited, $500 if she entered his house, and $1,000 whenever she took the children without his consent. One month, the deductions were so hefty that Betty ended up owing Dan $1,300. I don't know for sure, but I'm just guessing it was a lot of this because of her language. Like she liked to swear a lot, didn't she?
She really did.
Betty was fined $1,000 for using offensive language 10 times, $1,500 for trespassing outside Dan's house 6 times, and $2,500 for trespassing inside his house 5 times. When Betty showed up at his house demanding an explanation as to why she owed him money, he told her to leave. When she refused, he had her arrested for violating the restraining order. Betty asked the court to reconsider her alimony, requesting $30,000 a month, about a third of what she believed Dan earned each month. He countered with $7,300, down from $9,000, but a judge sided with Betty, sort of, and increased her alimony to $12,500 a month. This pushed Betty into a higher tax bracket, so the taxes on the new payment meant she actually received less than the previous $9,000. Upon the court's request, Betty submitted an itemized list of her 1986 expenses, which totaled over $220,000.
Can't remember. Multiply that times 3.
Right. and asked for her alimony payment to be set to at least $23,600 a month. The judge decided on $16,100.
Imagine the judge. Like, that's so much money.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, her alimony payments are more than the judge is making,
Right.
and probably most lawyers in the room. So it just must have seemed somewhat absurd
Yeah,
to the judge and a lot of other people.
right. When Betty tried to hire a divorce attorney in San Diego, she couldn't find anyone who was willing to do battle with Dan Broderick. So she went to Los Angeles and hired Daniel Jaffe, who was also a very good attorney. So confident after their first meeting, she treated herself to a new $15,000 maroon Jaguar. Although Jaffe soon tired of Betty's shenanigans, here's an excerpt from a letter he sent to her. If you can live within the guidelines, I will continue to represent you, but I want to spend my time on finding out what happened to the Broderick monies and getting you some of them, rather than spending my time keeping you out of jail. He closed by suggesting she seek psychiatric treatment. Their relationship was short-lived. Betty went through 5 attorneys in the coming years, eventually representing herself.
Can you believe that eventually she's going to be defending herself?
She seems like the kind of person who would want to defend herself, so yes, I can
Just a
believe it.
very bad idea. But this Jaffe guy actually sounded like a pretty nice guy. Years later, when he heard that she was defending herself, he contacted the judge and told them that this was unfair and outrageous, that Betty was in a very difficult situation. She was fighting against Dan in a San Diego courtroom. So he was one of the people that was just like, this woman is not going to get justice because, of all the extenuating circumstances.
Right. Yeah, that is very nice of him when he didn't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Always cash-strapped, Betty once resorted to giving an attorney the $10,000 necklace from around her neck as a retainer. Betty finally agreed to see a psychiatrist after the prodding of everyone remaining in her life. The doctor called her the angriest client she had ever met. She called Dan to caution him to be careful with Betty because she believed she could be homicidal.
This might sound like a violation of doctor-patient confidentiality, but it's called a Tarasoff warning. It's when a therapist determines a client possesses a serious threat of danger to an identifiable individual. They must take reasonable steps to warn the potential victim, law enforcement, or both.
The doctor contacted Dan after her second meeting with Betty, too. So the doctor contacted Dan again, like a second time after the second meeting?
I think it had to be done each time.
Oh, okay, wow. But their relationship was short-lived. Betty didn't return after the third session. Quote, I'm not coming back because you're too good. You make me forget how much I hate him. We'll be back after a break.
If there was one thing that truly drove Betty over the edge, it was the custody of her and Dan's 4 children. She had practically been a single parent, present for every milestone and important moment in their lives. She'd volunteered, organized school events, and poured herself into their upbringing, only to have Dan arrange for her to be banned from their schools. From the day that she dropped the children off at Coral Reef Avenue, Dan had restricted her visitation. Yet even with the children, Betty sometimes felt conflicted, once telling the psychiatrist, well, I'm not going to be the single parent of 4 kids. He'll die first. The less I see of them, the better. No kids, no bother. You'll see. Ouch, that's really harsh, isn't it?
I guess I'm not sure exactly what she's saying here.
I think she's saying that she really doesn't want to be a single parent of 4 kids.
Okay.
Like if she and Dan can't do it together, she doesn't want full custody.
Okay. Yeah, that is pretty harsh.
While Dan liked to communicate with Betty via carefully worded letters for the official record, Betty preferred to pick up the phone. She took to leaving blistering messages on Dan's answering machine, sometimes just nasty, other times so wildly obscene they bordered on creative. Those calls didn't just fuel their feud, they landed her in serious trouble. In 1987, Betty spent 6 days in jail on a contempt of court charge, punished for what came out of her mouth. Here's an example of just one day's messages. Warning, these messages are very explicit. Okay, I don't mind swearing, but there is one word in here that I am uncomfortable saying, but I'm going to say it. It's the see you next Tuesday word.
Okay.
So I know our friends in Australia don't mind, and our friends in Great Britain, but Here
It's a pretty bad one.
kind of taboo, but I'm going to let it rip because Betty did. And
Okay.
I'm here for authenticity.
Gotcha.
This is a message to fuckhead and the cunt. You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate me about my plans for the weekend. Make me sick, both of you. I have a good mind to dump the kids back on you and drive away. Call me. We have a lot to talk about, asshole. And come pick up your 4 children that you're working so hard to have custody of. Congratulations. You can have them. A few minutes later, fuckhead, come get the kids. I want to get rid of them, but I don't like driving to your shitty neighborhood. Hurry up and come get them, asshole. An hour later, fuckhead and the cunt, come get the kids. And her last call of the day, I actually love this machine because then I can really just say anything I want. Tell the kids that you don't think it's wrong that you're screwing the cunt in the hall that has her legs wide open for anybody who comes by, and you paid for it. God, you got a sense of humor. I love it. You're all fucked. So Betty's favorite word or name for Linda was see you
Right.
next Tuesday.
I gathered that. Yeah. Thank you.
You got that?
Yep.
There was also a teen line at Dan's house with another answering machine. Dan frequently turned off the ringer, letting the calls go straight to the answering machine, where Linda's voice perkily gave the greeting. In response, Betty left dozens of profane messages, often highlighting her favorite word, see you next Tuesday. Quote, cunt, what is your voice doing on this machine? If it's the Broderick's residence, that assumes you're a Broderick, and you're nothing but a cunt. Anyway, where are my darling children? Here's a clip of one of the calls.
What's this? We can't come to the phone. You're not supposed to come to the phone at the house. You're supposed to at the house, answer the phone at the office.
So those bleeps were C words and other things.
Yeah, exactly. So Betty was so infuriated by Linda's voice on the machine, a judge told Dan, get the girlfriend off the machine. In general, I don't think that Linda purposefully tormented Betty, but on this occasion, why would she have left the message on the kid's answering machine?
Yeah,
It
that
did
is a
seem
little
like
bit
it
odd.
was taunting Betty.
Right.
It shouldn't be surprising that Dan saved the tapes and had them transcribed and used them against Betty in court. And she did threaten to kill him more than once on these tapes. Here's another message. Fuckhead, who do you think you're kidding? Look in the mirror and tell me. Who do you think you're kidding? Jesus Christ, you're like a slug with the fancy tie on. Too low to kick and too wet to step on. Does that ring a bell? Love to the cunt. While I think some of these messages are very funny, this was the answering machine, that the kid's answering machine, and they were subjected to hearing these messages on a daily basis.
Not so funny.
Dan brought the messages to a judge, and Betty's visitation privileges were temporarily paused, but even that didn't stop her. Betty said, I was entitled to explode, and the truth is, I loved leaving those messages. All I ever had was my tongue, and I did it for the shock value. And every time I used that language on his machine, I felt a little bit better for a while. I couldn't stop from doing it.
Just picturing what Betty would be like if she lived in an era of social media.
Yeah, she would be tough to deal with. So this next part is heart-wrenching. Dan even went so far as to record Betty's phone calls with the children. One of these tapes, later known in court as the Danny tape, captured a heartbreaking 30-minute conversation between Betty and her 10-year-old son. Here's a short clip.
Scum, Danny. He's absolute scum. He has cheated and lied and around. There's nothing...
Don't you think being mad for 2 years is enough, though, Mom?
We're the best family in the whole world. We were all so happy. All the kids and me were so happy. He was just...
I know we're going to be a lot happier if you just stop saying bad words.
Well, you tell that slime ball...
See what I mean, Mom? You're saying it right now. You better stop.
Oh, that is heartbreaking to hear.
It breaks my heart, literally.
Yeah, it's really sad. And I have to say, like, Danny is kind of wise beyond his years, saying, like, isn't 2 years enough to be angry?
Oh my God,
like,
absolutely.
It's probably time to, try to think about moving on.
In Bella Stumbo's book, Until the 12th of Never, the entire transcript of the call is revealed. The feud between Danny's parents clearly took a heavy toll on him. It must have devastated all the children, robbing them of the safety and stability every child deserves. Danny comes across as wise beyond his years, forced to grow up far too quickly. Betty spoke to him as if he were an adult, like a confidant,
Yeah.
while he repeatedly begged her to stop using foul language so he could come live with her. That's really what both of the boys wanted. They wanted to live with her, but she couldn't, put her behavior
Yeah.
and the language beside, long enough to put their best interest first. Betty did this with all of the children. She shared far too many adult details with them and pitted them against Dan and Linda. The tape ended with Danny saying, "So you want to be mad for another 2 years? And after that, 4 years? And then maybe another 6 years?" Like you said, Danny is so bright and perceptive. Betty has often claimed that she lived for her children and was the best mother. But Kim recalls it differently. She remembers a childhood marked by neglect, with parents too absorbed in their own battles to provide supervision, discipline, or emotional support. To her, Betty may have been physically present, but she had checked out mentally and emotionally when her children needed her the most. In her book, Kim talked about the younger years of her childhood, and she said they were very good. And, Betty was great then when she was the soccer coach, and, they took great family vacations. But, once the affair happened, something just changed.
Yeah, it seems like she was fixated on that. In 1987, as Christmas approached, Betty was going to take the kids skiing. She asked Dan for an extra $5,000 for the trip. He countered with $2,000. Betty refused to go unless he gave her $5,000. When Dan denied the money to Betty, she decided to go to Pasadena instead to spend the holidays with Brad Wright's family. Dan and Linda took the kids skiing. Annoyed at the thought of paying someone to tend after the family's 2 small Shih Tzus that she'd been stuck with, she tied red bows around Topsy and Muffin's necks and entered Dan's house illegally once again and left the dogs there for the week, unattended. Oh, boy.
Right? I mean, I don't know if there was a doggy door, but still.
Yeah, it's not going to be good. That Christmas, Betty mailed out cards to friends and family, but instead of a cheerful holiday update, she included a long, bitter letter cataloging her grievances against Dan over the past 3 years and the unraveling of her marriage. The woman who had once been so polished and image-conscious was gone. Betty no longer cared about appearances or about what people thought of her. What mattered now was bringing Dan down with her. She wanted to expose him to the world as a narcissistic adulterer, an alcoholic, and an abuser. Betty left for a week to Tahiti after the new year. She couldn't afford the trip, but needed a change of scenery. When she returned home, she found her home trashed. Someone had discharged a fire extinguisher in the living room, ruining her floors and furniture. Lee, 16, the second oldest Broderick child, the child that Betty said was most like her, was going through a hard time. Her coping mechanism was to party with a new group of unsavory friends. She ran away and remained missing for 6 months, checking in with her mother only occasionally. She was living on the beach, refusing to come home, and making choices that terrified Betty. Meanwhile, Dan disowned her and formally wrote her out of his will. At the time, Lee thought he was bluffing, but a few short years later, she would learn that Dan was a man of his word. When Lee finally resurfaced, Betty took her to a rehab facility, but she checked herself out after just 3 days. Her rebellion continued. Lee racked up so many speeding tickets that her license was eventually suspended. Not surprising at all that someone of her age would act out this way after what she'd been through.
Yeah, unfortunately, kids were collateral damage.
Dan proposed to Linda on bended knee on June 26, 1988, her 27th birthday, with an impressive diamond and emerald ring.
This may have also been a dig at Betty. I think the last Christmas that the Brodericks were together as a family, Betty had made many hints to Dan that she wanted like this emerald ring, this big emerald ring. And when she didn't get the emerald ring, Kim in her book said that she'd never seen Betty angrier, and she made a huge fit and ruined Christmas over it. So when I saw that Dan bought Linda, an emerald ring, I was like, oh, that's
sort of
kind
seems like
crappy.
it.
Yeah.
The story made the San Diego Union newspaper. Quote, "The earnest-looking fellow down on one knee on the floor at Dobson's the other night was attorney Dan Broderick, asking his paralegal, Linda Kolkina, to marry him. Much too public a proposal to turn down, they will marry in April. The onlookers at the restaurant smiled and cheered after the proposal. Linda and Dan told friends they wanted at least 5 children together. When Dan and Linda married at their mansion in the spring of 1989, he hired 2 security guards to watch over the festivities. Linda wanted him to wear a bulletproof vest, but Dan didn't think Betty would kill him because he was the golden goose. Linda begged him to install a security system or at least get a guard dog, but Dan balked. He knew that no matter what precautions he took, Betty would find a way to circumvent them. Here's Dan toasting his new bride.
As pretty as Linda is, her looks are not her best quality. She has the most wonderful, pleasant, sweet disposition of any woman I've ever known. I really mean that.
I put the cart before the horse there a little bit, but by this point, Dan and Betty were divorced. So he was not...
He wasn't a bigamist then. Okay,
Right.
Gotcha. Betty tried to move on. After she began dating Brad, the younger man, she went to a plastic surgeon for several more procedures, a forehead lift, eyelid surgery, and a tummy tuck. Later, she admitted it only made her feel better for about an hour. Nothing seemed to bring lasting happiness anymore. Betty sank into a deep depression from 1985 to 1989, and nothing could pull her out of it.
According to Betty, the sale of their family home on Coral Reef Avenue was the ultimate betrayal. Dan had told her that he planned to sell it, but only after he'd already purchased a grand 5-bed, 6-bath, Georgian-style mansion near a Balboa Park for $400,000. It was priced so low because the house was oddly placed in a modest neighborhood. The first 2 offers on the Coral Reef house fell through when Betty rejected them without much thought or explanation. But when the 3rd offer came in, Dan didn't breathe a word of it to her. Instead, she says that he used his legal know-how to push the sale through without her consent. Betty was in the middle of making a delightful roast beef for her visiting parents and sons when her newest attorney called her to tell her that her former family home had been under contract. And she snapped. She cheerfully told her parents that she had an errand to take care of and that she'd be right back. Fueled by rage, she climbed into her Chevy Suburban and drove straight to Dan's new home. He refused to talk to her, and he slammed the door in her face. She drove to the Coral Reef house, found a can of gasoline in the garage, and began pouring it through the house, but quickly came to her senses and returned to Dan's house. She didn't park on the street. Instead, she floored the accelerator, drove through the gate, with her tires ripping across the manicured lawn. She pressed the brake after she crashed into the front door. 2 of her children were inside the house when Dan came rushing out. Furious, he yanked open the Suburban's door, pulled her out, and punched her in the chest. Stunned, Betty fell to the ground, shocked that Dan had hit her. It was the first and only time that he'd ever hit her. There were also rumors that there was a knife in her Suburban.
Okay.
I don't think she threatened him with it, but later she said, "Oh, I had just been out shopping that day and bought a knife."
Okay.
Here's a clip of Betty talking about the incident to Oprah.
No.
You did try to drive the car through the door, did you not?
I did purposely, and, I did bang my car into his door. I didn't try to drive it through anything. I banged my car into his door the day that he sold the family home, the only home we've ever owned that had my name on it and his name on it. He sold it in court without notifying me in any way, shape, or form. And I went to his house and said, "How did you do that? You can't do that." And he told me I had 10 seconds to get off his property.
So then you got in the car.
And I looked at that house as the only asset. It was indeed the only asset that had my name on it. Nothing else did, ever.
Once again, it seems like she is not willing to take any accountability for her own actions. Not that
Right.
Dan is perfect, and
No, absolutely
he's obviously not a
not.
great guy either.
He
But
definitely antagonized her.
yeah, but she just seems like she can't own up to
Right,
her own
like
actions.
that's a normal response.
Right. Yeah. Well, of course I did that because of
Yeah,
this and
it's
this and
okay
this.
if you
Yeah.
Like I stopped at the door,
Right. Yeah.
but the door was damaged for what it's worth. The confrontation ended before anyone was hurt, but Betty's fury was palpable. When the police arrived, they put Betty into a straitjacket. Within hours, she was admitted to a mental hospital, where she spent the next 3 days. Another explosive chapter in a divorce that was already spiraling out of control. But she insisted to the psychiatrist that it was Dan who was crazy, not her. Betty's parents caught the next flight available home after they found out that she'd been institutionalized, embarrassed, and horrified by her actions. They never visited her at her home again. Betty told the LA Times, quote, "Their darling daughter got the big D word, and they couldn't handle it. All my life I tried so hard to be a good daughter, a good wife, a good neighbor. My husband unzips his fly and screws the bimbo, and I lose all that. My mother is a peach. If you called home at midnight and you had a flat tire, she'd lie in bed and have people bring her tea and crumpets while she worried about you. And you'd still be out on the freeway. What she doesn't understand is she only had one choice, his funeral or mine. I hate to tell you, she would have preferred mine. My daughter killed herself is more acceptable than my daughter stood up for herself." During her stay at the mental hospital, Betty received a diagnosis: borderline personality, histrionic, and narcissistic. Dan paid Betty $127,784 from the sale of the Coral Reef house and ponied up an additional $40,000 towards remodeling her new home. He must have been feeling guilty over his recent actions. Upon Betty's release from the hospital, he offered to pay for a week-long ski trip for her and the kids. She begrudgingly accepted. Betty's reputation around town was in tatters. People whispered behind her back, calling her Crazy Betty. She did her best to hold her head up high, using her quick wit to brush off the gossip and lead with a smile, no matter how awkward the encounter. She felt no shame for her behavior. In her mind, all the blame belonged to Dan and Linda, never to herself. Betty still tried to keep up appearances, meeting friends, volunteering, even working briefly at an art gallery, but her circle was shrinking. She wanted to move forward, yet wasn't sure what she was qualified to do anymore. And for those who stuck around, conversations with Betty inevitably circled back to the same theme: how Dan had wronged her. Many grew weary of her bitterness, and one by one they drifted away and chose Dan's side over hers. But Betty still had a close circle of friends, and they were deeply worried. To them, she no longer seemed capable of rational thought. They urged her to get help, but she refused to hear it. Once admired for her excellent parenting, Betty was so consumed by her war with Dan and Linda that her kids took a back seat. Her appearance suffered, she gained weight, and was unable to wear her designer clothes. Bills went unpaid, and the house she'd bought remained half renovated and largely unfurnished and infested with rats. Betty didn't have energy for any of it. She wasn't fun to be around anymore. Friends described her as bitter, mean, vindictive, and angry. And whenever someone suggested she needed help, Betty only dug her heels in deeper. In her mind, her rage was justified. She was the one who'd been wronged. She began to write a book she titled, "What's a Nice Girl to Do? A Story of White-Collar Domestic Violence in America." That book was never published, but she did go on to write another book that I read called Telling on Myself. So Betty joined a group called HALT, Help Abolish Legal Tyranny. They are a subversive group who charge that lawyers intentionally make the legal system more complicated than it needs to be, which limits access to the average American. They believe that all Americans should be able to handle their legal affairs simply, affordably, and equitably. Sounds like a pretty good idea, really,
Well, I
right?
mean, anyone who's ever read a contract can say that, yeah, this is way more complicated than it needs to be.
Betty found new supporters within this group who guided her decision-making. Dan tried to settle the divorce out of court back in 1985. He offered joint custody, likely to avoid paying child support, along with $9,000 a month in alimony and a share of the legal settlements he'd earned during their marriage. But his formula was complicated. For example, from a $600,000 settlement win, Betty's share, after expenses and deducting the support she'd already received, would shrink to about $65,000. Betty admitted, "I didn't know what the hell it meant, but I did know it sounded like I was getting royally screwed." Still, this was the best deal that Dan would ever put on the table, and Betty turned it down. She would continue to turn down every offer he made for years, and they declined in value. She was sure he was being dishonest about his earnings and holdings. I think there is evidence that he did have money hiding in different
Yeah,
places.
not surprising.
Does that sound like a bad deal to you? Like out of a $600,000 settlement, she would get about 10% of that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would be pretty good.
Frustrated by the lack of settlement, Dan moved for a bifurcated divorce. We've had at least one other case that did this. Do you remember?
No, I don't.
So, a bifurcated divorce means that you split the legal process into two parts, dissolving the marriage first and dividing the assets later.
Okay.
And so that's what Dan had done. So that's when he married Linda.
Right.
They had been divorced for I think at least a year.
Okay.
Betty struggled to find an attorney she trusted and refused to appear in court without representation. On July 16th, 1986, Dan stood before a judge alone and was granted both the divorce and full custody of the children. And that's when Betty's rage escalated. Her messages on the answering machine grew more vicious by the day. In response, Dan came up with a new punishment for every offensive word she left on the machine. He fined her. We already talked about this part. By late 1987, negotiations had stalled again until Betty came back with her own proposal. She requested $1 million in cash plus $25,000 a month for the next 10 years, whether she remarried or not. She wanted the title to her house and car, a $1 million life insurance policy with herself as the beneficiary to that life insurance policy for Dan, much of the furniture they owned together, and for Dan to cover her legal fees. Altogether, this would have added up to about $4 million. What surprised many people was that she didn't ask for custody of the children. She only wanted visitation. She admitted she had no interest in being a single parent and felt too emotionally unstable to take on 4 children full time. Dan flatly refused her offer. By the end of 1987, Betty's financial situation was dire. She had over $200,000 in credit card debt. Betty said, "The only time I felt halfway normal was when I was either eating or signing charges. Those things I could do alone, and they made me feel like everything would still be okay." On December 27, 1988, their 8-day divorce trial began. Betty represented herself. At times, she held her own, but at other times, she couldn't keep up. The final divorce judgment between Betty and Dan Broderick was both complicated and devastating. After years of bitter court battles, the millions of dollars in community property the couple had built between 1969 and 1989 were reduced to just over $28,000 for Betty. This figure came after Dan undervalued their community property and his law firm and applied more than $1 million in Epstein credits, which reimbursed him for community debts he claimed to have paid with his own money after their separation, effectively wiping out much of Betty's share of their marital estate. On top of that, she was ordered to cover $5,000 in legal fees and even half of Dan's Harvard loans presented in court as their educational expenses.
Oof.
On paper, Betty would still receive monthly spousal support of $16,000, but to Betty, it felt hollow compared to the fortune Dad had amassed during their marriage and the life of luxury that she had once known. The settlement left her responsible for a heavy share of the community debts, while granting her almost nothing from the assets that she'd helped create. To her, the judgment underscored how the courts and Dan's legal maneuvering had minimized her sacrifices, leaving her with little financial independence and a sharp sense of betrayal.
Does sound like a pretty brutal settlement.
Absolutely. I mean, she should have walked away with at least $1 million in cash,
Yeah.
I feel like. I just want to talk about Epstein credits for a second because it's really confusing. But Epstein credits are a California divorce rule that comes from a 1979 case called In Re Marriage of Epstein. In simple terms, they allow one spouse to be reimbursed for certain payments they make after the couple separates, but before the divorce is finalized. If, for example, one spouse uses their post-separation income to pay community debts like the mortgage, property taxes, or car payments, they can ask the court to credit them back for those amounts when the assets are divided. The reasoning is that those payments benefit both spouses, so the paying spouse shouldn't be stuck covering the other person's share. But there are exceptions. If the payments were intended as spousal support or if the paying spouse was the only one using the property, the court might deny the credit. In Betty Broderick's case, Dan used Epstein credits to shrink her settlement, claiming reimbursement for expenses he said he covered after their separation. It was one of the several ways that he chipped away at the final amount that she would receive. And he really did screw Betty over royally with this settlement.
Yeah, it sure sounds like it.
So since 1983, all of those years, every single time that he paid for something,
Right.
He took that, he gave her money for her house repairs.
Yeah.
And, he chipped that away. And
Yep.
every vacation that, he gave her money for, he took, that out of the settlement.
Right.
So it all just made the final settlement smaller.
Yeah.
Well, that's where we're going to end for today.
Still no crime. Well, a few crimes on
There's
Betty's
definitely
parts, I
some
guess.
crimes
But
on both of their parts, really.
true.
All right, I have some questions for you. Was it possible for Betty to receive a fair settlement in the San Diego court system where Dan was a skilled and accomplished attorney?
I mean, that's hard to say. It would have been very difficult for her, I would think. But at the same time, she just, the way she approached the whole thing really didn't do herself any favors. She could have gotten a much better settlement if she had, I think, tried harder to do what she
should have
needed
had
to
an
do.
attorney with her
Yeah,
during the divorce
absolutely.
trial, for sure. I think up to that point, she was treated pretty fairly.
Mm-hmm.
What effect do you think the answering machine messages had on the children?
Not a good one. It's just terrible to put your kids
Mhm.
through that. Like just having your kids even hearing you, fight bitterly and say nasty things to each other. That's not a good thing. But when you call and leave a message on their machine that they're going to hear.
I want to say it was an episode of Oprah. I could be wrong. I used to watch Oprah all the time even when I was like a kid. She said once, when you fight in front of your children, it changes who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always remembered that. We're not perfect, but we don't really fight in front of our kids. I don't think we have a couple of times.
Yeah.
Or one time, we don't fight often. I believe we fought in front of maybe our son when he was really little.
Uh-huh.
And he might have said, "Are you guys getting divorced?" And we were
Oh.
like, no, it's just a fight. It's
Yeah.
okay to fight. But it's when you never fight and you do fight and your kids hear it,
Right.
that can
Kinda
be bad
freaks them out a
too.
little bit too, yeah.
But the kids in this case were definitely used to their parents
I
fighting.
feel really bad for them.
Was Betty's anger justified, or did it cross the line into obsession?
Yes and yes. I think it was she was certainly justified in her anger, but at a certain point, you got to move on.
When
with
your anger
life.
is destroying who you are, the
Right.
fabric of your being, you definitely need help.
Yeah, it just seemed like she was obsessed and couldn't let it go and couldn't focus on anything else.
What could Dan have done differently?
Well, he could have not gaslighted her for years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And acted like he wasn't having an affair. He could have definitely been more upfront about it and, just made a clean break earlier when he realized that he wanted to be with someone else.
Do you get the sense that part of the reason he was gaslighting her because he was moving money around and, doing seedy things like that?
Maybe he was, trying to prepare for, the divorce at some point, but I don't know, it's hard to say.
Do you think that Betty should have gotten 50% of all of his assets?
I mean, kind of. Yeah. I think in a situation like that, that seems sort of fair.
And it seems like Dan almost had unlimited potential, like financially, and he could have remade that money.
Right.
I think that's what a lot of people point to in this case is like, he could have given her that money easily.
Yeah.
Still would have had plenty of money.
Yeah, I think.
And left her with some dignity.
Right. I think he probably should have been a little more generous and just, if I was him, I'd be like, I just want to get this done with and I want to move on. And the easiest way to do that is going to be by giving more money. And so, yeah.
Before we go, I have some questions for you.
Oh,
do you remember
good.
James Lipton?
Of course I do.
Inside the Actors Studio.
Yes.
Well, rest in peace, James Lipton. I believe that he has passed on.
I believe so.
Do you remember the questions?
I don't remember them, but I do remember he asked the same questions
These
of
are
everybody.
supposed to be rapid fire, and I will answer them too. Slightly unfair because
Right, you've had a little more time to prepare.
more time. Yeah. What is your favorite word?
First word that came to my mind was the C word, but that's really not
The
my
C
favorite
word,
word. See you next Tuesday. I never use that word, so it's not. But my favorite word, love.
Well, you sold that one, honey. Cookie. The
Cookie.
C word, cookie.
Okay, that's a good
Or
word.
snack. That's probably, I really don't know. That's kind of a weird question. I
It
don't know what
really is a
favorite word
weird
is
question,
either.
yeah.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to go back to my favorite word
right.
because this is what happens. My brain is too slow.
Right.
My favorite word is discombobulated.
Okay.
I really love that word.
That's a nice word.
My least favorite word, I'm going to go with puke.
Really?
I don't know. It's just the
That's
first
funny
thing that came
because
to mind.
my least favorite word is diarrhea.
That's a bad word, too.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I think when someone is really like passionate about something and really good at something, I'm blown away by people that are just like really, really into something and really passionate about it.
Like me?
Yes,
It's
just
actually
like you.
bad because I'm not passionate about pretty much anything.
Yeah, you are.
Being in nature is what I would say, or taking a shower. Do you know, like when you take a shower and like all your good ideas come in the shower, like literally?
Not really so
That
much.
doesn't happen to you?
No, but nature for sure. That
Yeah.
is very true for me too.
What is a turnoff for you?
People who are like selfish. I just don't like people who are selfish.
My answer is racism, closed-mindedness, and lack of empathy. What sound or noise do you love?
Time for lunch, time for breakfast, time for dinner. Oh, that's from It's a Wonderful Life.
Oh, my favorite sound is your voice
Oh, thank you.
and also the ocean. What sound or noise do you hate?
I'm going to go back to puking.
Oh, that's a good one. That is true.
Oh, that's such a horrible sound.
I feel kind of bad, and I hope our neighbors aren't listening, but lately, and you know this because I'll text you like,
Totally
what
know.
the heck? Our neighbors outside in their pool when we're like,
Yeah.
they have every right to be out there, but
That can enrage you.
it does make, I know I feel bad again. Like it's just our window, it's been so hot.
Yeah.
And our windows have been closed like most of the summer. The air
Right.
conditioning's on, but like it's been a little cooler, so I've been opening the windows. And
Yeah.
then when I have
the
to
one
hear
chance-
the joyful sounds of children,
It's just that it's always
it's all the
there.
time. Yeah, it is. Yeah. What's your favorite curse word?
I like the F word.
The F word. Come on, Rich. You can do it.
I actually really like motherfucker.
Yeah.
It just kind of rolls off the tongue.
So I know people think we don't swear, but we do. And I really, it's very cathartic for me to say fuck. It really is.
Yeah.
Apologies to our listeners who don't like to hear swear words on our podcast.
Yes.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
This podcast has made me want to be a lawyer. I really
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think it would just be an interesting profession. Like I think
What kind of lawyer though? Because
Well,
there's a lot of different avenues.
the thing
A
that would be
divorce lawyer?
interesting no, the thing that would be interesting would be to be a criminal lawyer, either prosecuting or defense.
I think that's a lot harder than you think.
Oh
like,
yeah, I'm not
morally.
saying it would be easy.
Mhm.
I think it would be very hard, and it would be hard morally. Like if you were a defense lawyer having to defend someone that you know in your heart is guilty.
But everyone, should
Yeah, exactly.
is entitled to it, a good
Yes.
attorney.
For sure.
All right, last question.
Wait, what is
Oh.
your answer?
A doctor. I think
Oh,
that I
okay.
wish that I would have, been a little more aggressive in my education, but
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have had the attention span for,
Yeah, you could have been a good
that
doctor, I
long
think.
of a, yeah. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I would like to hear God tell me, and I had a friend of mine had this theory
Mm-hmm.
that heaven is it's like a giant database that you can see anything that ever happened. Like if you
Okay.
went up there and you were like, I want to see what happened with JFK. Like, was there a second assassin? And God would be like, yeah, sure. Here's our
So there's like a good
computer."
audio visual guy up in heaven.
No, it'd be like a Google, like you have Google, but you could look up anything
Okay.
from any time, anywhere, and see exactly what happened.
I think about things like that sometimes and I'm like, I need to try harder because someday if I have to see the tape of this, I'm going to be horrified.
Yes, that's true.
I would like to hear God say, love your podcast.
I'm sure God's a big fan of our podcast.
Well, put a fork in us because we are done.
We are done. So we have to
And
come
hey,
back
good
for
news.
part 3.
Right, but we are empty nesters now, so we can have cake for dinner.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Excellent. More Boston
More
cream
Boston
pie.
cream pie.
Sounds good to me. Well, if you'd like to hear part 3 of this case right now, please join us on patreon.com/lovemarrykill. For $5 a month, you get early ad-free access plus a monthly bonus episode.
Thank you all so much for listening. We love you and we appreciate your support more than we can ever express. Please rate, review, follow, and subscribe. Find us on social media or send us an email at lovemarrykill@gmail.com. Until next time.
Don't kill your wife.
And don't kill your husband.